start with a question for Mr. Bullock from Chuck Johnson. He will have a minute to respond. Then Mr. Hill will have 1 minute to comment. And then Mr. Bullock will have 30 seconds for a final response. Chuck, your question?
Good evening, Mr. Bullock. In the late 1990s, Montana passed an oil and gas tax holiday on horizontal wells. It reduced the tax rate on new production from nearly 10% to less than 1% for the first 18 months. Supporters say it's been a boon for more drilling. Others say the drilling would have come anyway. Do you support or oppose continuing this holiday?
I think there are great things going on with oil and gas development in Montana, and it impacts more than just the Sydney area. It actually impacts the whole state. Lisa and my daughter's teacher's husband, even in Helena, is over there working in the oil field. So good things are happening. Our tax rates are lower than North Dakota's, and our time to actually permit is faster. So we do have the tax holiday. North Dakota has one that's set at $50. Right now, oil's about $100 a barrel. I don't think right now, as we go forward, we need to monkey with that tax holiday. We do need to address infrastructure needs. And I'll talk with legislators throughout Montana, and certainly eastern Montana, how we best address those infrastructure needs, but not necessarily by repealing the tax holiday right now.
Mr. Hill, 1 minute.
You know, it's a cost recovery period where there is a reduced tax on production is very important to encourage and incentivize producers to drill. These wells are quite high risk, particularly in Montana, where the layers of shale are thinner and where there's less oil in them, and horizontal drilling involves a lot of risk. And so I think the tax holiday is a good way to encourage drilling because it allows the producers to recover their capital costs early on. It encourages more drilling, and I think we'll see a lot more drilling as a result of it. I think a lot of people don't realize that the Bakken was actually discovered in Montana, and it was discovered because horizontal drilling was incentivized in Montana, and that is where the early drilling occurred. So I would definitely oppose a change in that tax.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
And it is a recognition as we build this, though, that most of the oil, I mean, we're sort of in the shallow end of the pool. Why is it that North Dakota has so much development and Montana isn't quite at that level? It is in part where the oil is. But we do need to keep things stable and predictable as we go forward. And also, though, work on the infrastructure issues to make sure that law enforcement's on the street, that we have enough commercial driver's license opportunities, things that I've already been working on as Attorney General, things that I'll work on as Governor.
Thank you. And now a question from Tom Ludy to Mr. Hill.
Yes, Mr. Hill. In the last appraisal cycle, Montana's farms and ranches expected a tax increase, which was supposed to be spread over 6 years. But the state hit them with most or nearly all of the increase in year one, essentially overtaxing them more than $25 million, according to the governor's budget office. Farmers have had to sue to get their money back. To the extent the Department of Revenue answers to the governor, how would you have handled this situation?
You know, this is a situation where during the legislative session, as you know, Tom, the administration suggested that the language of the law as it was passed would provide for a 6-year implementation. Then after the legislation passed, they wrote rules to implement it immediately. And the loser, of course, were farmers and ranchers. As you know, it isn't just the appraisal increase that gets implemented, it's also the formula that gets adjusted, the adjustment to the formula. And so in my administration, I'm not going to play hide the ball and I'm not going to do a bait and switch. If what we say before the legislature is what we'll do after the legislature. One of the biggest complaints that I hear among Montanans and among Montana legislators is that they draft a bill with an expectation that this is what the outcome is going to be, and then we have a circumstance where the rule writers change the full intent of the law. That's not good for Montana. It reduces confidence in the business community and others to invest in Montana. So we'll be straight up with the voters, and we'll be straight up with the legislature on what we're going to do.
Mr. Bullock, 1 minute.
Hey, Tom, I think it also, though, underscores, and especially this last reappraisal cycle, that when we reappraise every 6 years, dramatic things can happen during that period as well. And it's time that we actually look at shortening the reappraisal cycle to every 2 years, and doing that at the residential level as well. And that will essentially, it'll make as the phase-in or immediate hit, it wouldn't be as significant, and it's also going to more accurately address the changing market conditions. So there would be an incremental cost in doing so on the government side, but I think from the taxpayer side, all across the board, they'd be a lot more comfortable with more frequent appraisals.
Mr. Hill, 30 seconds.
I think what the important point here is that farmers and ranchers had one expectation and then another expectation was the result. And I think that this is one of the most common complaints I hear from businesses that I travel Montana is the uncertainty in our tax code and the uncertainty in the application of our tax code. A good example of that is what is going on right now in this community with all the tax protests over the valuation of the refineries. And the result of that is that the county is not able to spend money on services, cities aren't able to spend money on services, and schools aren't able to spend money on the services because that money gets impounded. That's not a good idea. Transparency, directness, openness, honesty, those are the hallmarks of my business career, they're the hallmarks of my professional career, and as governor, they'll be the hallmarks of the Department of Revenue.
Thank you. And now a question from Jackie Yamanaka to Mr. Bullock.
Mr. Bullock, Bainville, Culbertson, Sydney, they're among the Bakken oil patch communities that are struggling with things like crumbling roads, degrading sewer systems, and packed schools. The community leaders there will say the problem is that the state is taking the lion's share of the oil and gas revenue. So what would you do as governor to help these communities?
I think we do need to recognize that the opportunities for the oil and gas does extend far beyond Sydney. I mean, I used in an earlier question the example of my daughter's teacher, Lisa and my daughter's teacher. Another example would be I was up in Hamilton and a banker said, you know, the lumber yard's actually picking up in some ways because, you know, some of the builders that didn't have enough going on in the Bitterroot are now actually working out in Sydney. So that there are some great opportunities there. But we do need to address the infrastructure issues up front. I think the split's 53-47% state to local, and we get about $100 million a year at the state level. We need to address those impacts. There's a coal impact fund as an example, but that comes after the revenues are already there. What we need to do is either with a piece of the surplus or slight adjustment of those numbers, make an impact fund so cities like Sydney can apply to that, get revolving grants, get some of the money on the back end as a result.
Mr. Hill.
You know, the interesting problem we have in eastern Montana is that we're not yet enjoying the revenues that come off the oil boom. Most of what you're talking about, Jackie, is actually spillover from the North Dakota side, and that makes it even more challenging. In addition to that, cities were kind of left out of the sharing formula of oil and gas revenues. Counties and school districts get the lion's share of that. And even then, we have the challenges because not every school district in the county all get equal sharing. So one of the things that we're proposing to address this, frankly, is to cap the coal trust fund for 10 years. We're going to ask the voters to do that, divert that revenue stream into infrastructure so that we can expand the TSEP program, the Treasure State Endowment Program, to help local governments fund some of these impacts. In addition to that, and there's some instances where it's just a timing differential. The money will be coming from the oil and gas development, but because of the holiday, that money isn't coming yet. And I think that there are ways for us to advance some funds to those local governments so that they can address those needs, that they can be paid out of additional revenues in the future.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
I think, and we definitely do need to address the infrastructure needs. The Congressman's plan about capping the coal severance tax trust, I mean, there are some challenges in that because that money is actually what is funding right now, the Treasure State Endowment Program and others. But either way, I think where we do agree is that we as a state overall, not just in Sydney or Culbertson or Bainville, have an obligation because we want to make sure that the benefits of this continue for a long time, so we have to do it right and provide assistance in eastern Montana.
And now a question from Chuck Johnson to Mr. Hill.
Mr. Hill, this week you're bringing Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker to Montana to campaign for you. He's perhaps best known for striking down collective bargaining rights for public employees in Wisconsin. What is your position? Do you favor ending or weakening collective bargaining rights for public employees in Montana?
My views on collective bargaining have been consistent throughout. I believe if people want to join a labor union, they ought to be able to join a labor union. If they don't want to join a labor union, they shouldn't be compelled to join a labor union. You know, what I admire about Scott Walker is that he inherited a huge budget deficit and a serious financial problem in the state. And he was able to solve the problem, and there was a lot of alarm in the beginning because people thought, well, this was going to adversely impact services, or kids weren't going to be able to be educated. But the truth is that there's more money going to schools there now. The teachers are actually getting paid better than they were. They balanced the budget. They actually have a surplus. And I think that that was reflected in the overwhelming support he got in the recall election. He actually got more votes and more support in the recall campaign than he did in the original election. It sometimes is difficult to make those kinds of hard decisions, but there are a number of Republican governors around the state that are taking on, around the country, that are taking on some really serious challenges, and they're having great success at it, and he's one.
Mr. Bullock.
I think what the congressman said is that we would be a right to work for less state, and he said that throughout. Our current laws don't require anybody to join a union just to pay their fair share of the representation and the opportunities for it. And what we saw in Wisconsin last year, it was a madhouse. How do you focus on jobs and creating opportunities for the next generation if it's just essentially a war on public employees and others? Emblematic, or bringing the governor to Montana after seeing that, and also seeing some of the problems of last legislative session, where the governor had 79 vetoes. The record before was 19. I mean, we don't need to become Wisconsin. We can become Montana and do that much better, and we will do that much better if John Walsh and I are elected governor and lieutenant governor.
Mr. Hill, 30 seconds.
No one has suggested that Montana is going to become Wisconsin, and nobody is proposing that. The complaint I hear mostly with respect to labor union dues are people who believe that the dues should not be used to support political causes or political candidates that they disagree with. And so I do support right to work, and I support right to work because it helps both union and non-union workers. Of the 12 right to work states in the western United States, 11 of them have higher take-home pay than the state of Montana does. They're producing jobs at a faster pace than we are in Montana, and they have more dynamic economies.
Now a question from Tom Ludy for Mr. Bullock.
Yes, Mr. Bullock. College tuition has more than doubled since 2001 as university costs have increased and state legislatures have cut support for in-state students. The debate over the years has shifted from restoring the state's dwindling share to merely freezing it at current levels. Give us your specifics on managing tuition costs.
Budgets are often a reflection not just of fiscal priorities but of values. And when the last legislative session didn't adequately fund higher education and tuitions increased 5% a year, I mean, that's a tax on every working family. And I'll make sure that I will freeze tuition for the next 2 years. We have the money in the bank to do it, and we need to work to make sure to do that. Now, and part of the greater question is also that over time the state share has decreased. Businesses come to Montana and want to stay in Montana because of a talented and trained workforce. We need to be investing in higher education, and we certainly don't need to do it on the backs of working families in Montana.
Mr. Hill.
I think that the way you keep tuition low is to make it the first priority when you do budgeting, not the afterthought of budgeting. If the university system and the universities and the Board of Regents say to the universities, look, we want you to put together a budget that says that we're not going to let tuition grow, say, at a rate faster than the rate of inflation, a budget will be built around that. And that's what we need to do in all of government. I'm advocating for a concept called priority budgeting, and I think it ought to apply to the university as well, where you start by asking the question, what values underlie this program or this activity? How are we going to measure whether or not we're achieving the goals that we want to reach? Who are we going to hold accountable to doing that? And the university, frankly, I think needs a good dose of that. When I was in Congress, I voted time and again to raise the Pell Grant to help low-income families, but tuition was going up faster than we were able to increase the grants. So I think the university system has to have a different priority, and the priority should be keeping tuition low first.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
Not quite sure what the congressman said. I know that come 28 days from now is an election. And 2 months later, we have to submit a budget. In my budget is going to be a freeze on tuition for the next 2 years. And I think that is a reflection of values to make sure that working class Montana families that are already struggling to try to make it through and get a college degree, they're not going to have a tuition increase in the next 2 years.
And now a question from Jackie Yamanaka to Mr. Hill.
Mr. Hill, it's well known you're pro-life. So what will that mean if you're elected governor? Are you going to seek policies to achieve that goal?
You know, as you know, today in the United States, both in the U.S. Constitution and in the state constitution, the way the courts have interpreted them, my view is not in favor with the courts. And that doesn't mean, though, that I don't think my view is correct. I believe that every life is worth living. I believe that every life is a gift. And I believe that people who believe that need to stand up for life. And in fact, I believe that if I don't stand for life, then who will stand for life? I think that, though, there are a lot of more moderate positions that we can support. For example, what's on the ballot right now, which is a parental notification bill that requires abortion providers to notify parents within 48 hours before they would perform an abortion. It provides a bypass for certain circumstances, and it also has a limitation that says that people can't coerce a young girl either into having abortion or not having abortion. I think there are measures like that that are broadly supported by a wide range of Montanans that I will advance and I will support.
Mr. Bullock.
Difficult and personal decisions, I don't think should be made by the congressman and I on health care. And the Supreme Court 40 years ago, and it should be made in consultation with a woman, with her husband, in consultation with her doctor and her faith community. 40 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court said that women have rights, reproductive rights of privacy. And our Montana Supreme Court has said the same. We need to spend more time actually promoting women's health care and promoting healthy decisions than attacking it. And I think that that's even last legislative session when they said we wouldn't fund Title X funding for women's health care. I mean, that's, again, not a reflection of budget priorities. That's a reflection of values. Congressman has said that even in cases of rape and incest, that he would criminalize abortion. We're beyond that 40 years later, and we need to do better.
Mr. Hill, 30 seconds.
You know, Steve opposed the ban on partial birth abortion. He opposes the limitations, simple limitations that would be in a notification bill. I think that when people are considering an abortion, they should be fully informed, and the law ought to require abortion providers to make sure that people are fully informed. What's interesting about this is all of those have been determined to be constitutional. So the United States Constitution has no problem with any of those kinds of reforms. Steve is the person that's really out of the mainstream here, not me.
And now it's time for each candidate to ask a question of his opponent. Mr. Hill, what is your question for Mr. Bullock?
Steve, good evening.
Long time no see.
Yeah, we did this at lunch today. So, Steve, the legislature passed a bill. It was House Bill 585. And House Bill 585 required transparency among agencies, including the Department of Justice, requiring that contracts that are entered into in the hiring of counsel be made public, and the terms of those contracts be made public, and that when there were circumstances where the fees could exceed $250,000 or over $400 an hour, that there be a commission by the governor that would review those contracts to make sure that they were appropriate. You testified against that bill, and the governor is one of the bills that the governor vetoed. My question to you is this, is that in this campaign, you've solicited campaign contributions from law firms all over the country. In fact, I think you've taken over $400,000 in contributions outside Montana, much of that from law firms. Will you disclose how much of that money came from law firms that had contracts with the state of Montana?
Congressman, all of the contracts that the state of Montana enters into, and there are cases and contracts before I became Attorney General and after, are all public documents, and your researchers have all requested them. So I think you certainly have all of that. And any cases that are settled or otherwise resolved, that's also a matter of public record. And the ability to know who gets paid for cases where they're working on behalf of the state, I think is well known. Now, at the end of the day, yeah, it would be nice if an Attorney General's office never even had to hire outside counsel. But given the size of some of the cases that we deal with, and given some of the stakes, I mean, the ability to get a $9 million and put it in the Montana Mental Health Trust to actually help mental health throughout all of our communities in the state, I mean, there are cases where we need outside counsel. And we entered into some agreements, and that's all public record.
Mr. Hill, 1 minute.
Well, the people can request that information, but of course, if you don't know the contract's been entered into, there's no way you would know to ask for it. That's why it's so important that that information be published so that people would have it available. I will tell you this, that as governor, I'll make sure that every contract that everybody enters into in Montana is a matter of public record, so people won't have to search for that kind of information. You know, if we want to avoid even the appearance of corruption, the best way to do that is for transparency. We have a Constitution that puts an emphasis on the public's right to know, and that implies a voluntary transparency. But Steve didn't answer the real question. The real question is it how many of those law firms that have these special deals that pay hundreds of thousands, in some instances millions of dollars, how many of those have been contributing to his campaign? That's what we're asking to find out.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
How many dollars have been contributed of individuals that have worked and either worked with me? I certainly don't know, Congressman. I don't know from the standpoint that I've gotten $20 contributions from individuals down the street. The maximum contribution that we've been able to take to date is $630. And I'll tell you, if we really are concerned about corruption in politics, that $630 isn't going to be enough to buy a guy like me, and I would sure hope that it wouldn't be enough to buy a guy like you.
And now, Mr. Bullock, what is your question for Mr. Hill?
Congressman Hill, you often say that, or mention that you're a recovering economist, and I need some of the help with the math. That masquerading as a school plan, you've said you'd give a $200 million property tax break. You've said you'd get rid of the business equipment tax. That's another $180 million. You said you want to reduce the marginal income tax and the capital gains tax rates. Even at 1%, that would be another $300 million. We're not even talking yet about investment in tuition or public employee pay. If my math is right, that's about $680 million. So just what you've said thus far, you've burned through our surplus 1.5 times without making any meaningful investments in areas that we need. And how does the math work?
Great, good question, and I appreciate you asking me. Our plan is to use oil and gas revenues. The state receives about $230 million worth of oil and gas revenues a year. Of that, $105 million of that goes to the local governments, as we were just discussing, leaving about $125 million to the state of Montana. We want to dedicate that money to education funding and to do it in a way that reduces property taxes to support education. The result of that will be every landowner, every property owner, every homeowner, every small business in Montana will get substantial property tax relief. Business equipment tax will go down as a consequence. Your homeowner's tax, your home taxes will go down, and so will all the business taxes. I do believe that Montana has a high marginal income tax rate, a high marginal capital gains tax rate. And as we develop our natural resources, I want to see us begin to address those taxes as well. But our plan for this biennium is permanent tax relief. You'll get it in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, and on. Reduction of your property taxes. It'll be a better funding source for education, and it'll bring more dynamic to Montana's economy.
But again, the 200 million or the math just doesn't add up because you're not creating new dollars. What you're saying is you'll give a tax cut of $200 million, but there's not necessarily any new revenue coming in as a result. And we are responsibly developing our resources, and we're doing a great job. I mean, this land board's actually brought in $360 million. The last time a governor, under Governor Martz, the last time a Republican, it was almost half of that, $190 million. So you can't make money just out of thin air. If you're promising $700 million of tax cuts, we're either going to do something else and you're going to balance that by having a sales tax, or you're going to be making some cuts, and the voters ought to be able to know where those cuts are going to be made.
Mr. Hill, 30 seconds.
We've proposed $200 million of the tax cuts. The funding source is the revenues that come from oil and gas. It spreads the benefit of that across all of Montana so that we're all beneficiaries of the development of that natural resource. As oil and gas production grows, that should give us an opportunity to reduce further taxes on Montana residents, and we want to do that as that development occurs. You know, if you look at the Wyoming example, where they fund education entirely off from coal and off from energy development, people have much lower property taxes as a result of that. Teachers are paid more. There's more funding for education. It's a model that I think we can bring to Montana. It'll take a long time to do that. But as those revenues come in, we will consistently try to lower taxes as part of the benefit of those increase in revenues.
Thank you. And now a question from Chuck Johnson for Mr. Bullock.
Mr. Bullock, in style and substance, how would a Bullock administration compare with the current administration of Governor Schweitzer?
I think that some great things have happened in the last 8 years. We look at when every other state ended up in the black, we continued to, or in the red, we continued to be in the black. We've had incredible growth in so many areas, and exciting things are happening. And that part I certainly want to continue. I want to continue to maintain and challenge every expense. Be careful with your budget, have an ending fund balance, invest in education. I mean, we had full-day kindergarten, and I want to both develop our resources and diversify our economy. In style and substance, it would be a bit different in as much as that substantively I think there are some changes we need to make to our Economic Development Office. And I'll work and bring people together. We'll also focus, it'll be a governor's level priority to do more for our veterans and military families, and John Walsh will take that lead.
From a style point of view, there would probably be less glib and more grit from my administration over the Schweitzer administration. From a substance point of view, we'll have more better paying jobs. You know, Montana is one of the few states in the country that has yet to recover the loss of jobs that we occurred during the financial crisis. And Montanans are 49th in the nation in terms of take-home pay. And if we look at the states that surround us, they're adding jobs at a faster pace than we are, and they're adding jobs that pay better than the jobs in Montana. We live in this state with this incredible amount of wealth. Natural resource wealth is part of it, but the human wealth is also part of it. We have Montanans are known for their work ethic all over the country. What we want to do is to take advantage of that work ethic here. We have to stop exporting the most important resource that we have, and that's our kids. So the difference when I'm governor is going to be a focus on gaining jobs at a much faster pace, as well, and creating a climate to do that, as well as the kind of jobs that pay more so that we can support our families.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
And I've looked through the Congressman's website, and I'm still looking for that jobs plan that will immediately make it so that we go from 47th all the way up to the top. Again, good things have been going on. Even the Chamber of Commerce says we have the 8th fastest long-term growth rate in jobs. Tax Foundation and the Chamber of Commerce says 8th best tax structure for businesses. Chamber of Commerce says the best place to be an entrepreneur. So good things have been occurring, and we'll build on them and make them even better.
And now a question from Tom Ludy to Mr. Hill.
Yes, Mr. Hill. I want to go back to your property tax relief plan, if we could. You've promised permanent property tax relief by using revenue from oil and gas and coal to, pay for education. But similar policies in Wyoming have recently provided anything but, permanent relief. The state rolled out cuts this year as falling natural gas prices threatened to rip $1 million hole in its budget. They're talking about 80 to 125 jobs cut from their university system, plus another 50 cuts, in other state departments. How do you avoid putting Montana on a fiscal roller coaster?
Well, I think if you look at Wyoming's model, the governor of Wyoming was here about a month and a half ago, and we were visiting about their economic model. And today, the state of Wyoming has between $15 and $16 billion in their reserve funds. And so they certainly could draw upon those reserve funds if they wanted to balance the budget. I'm not going to tell the governor there what his priorities ought to be. But if you look at the $230 million that Montana earned in 2011, that is not at a peak period. As a matter of fact, it's at a trough period. And that's at a time when natural gas prices were at a very low period, not at a high period, and the production was also at a low period. So we're not starting from a high level and from that trying to reduce our commitment to education. Here's the fact, is that today we're losing more and more mill levies for schools. We're losing more and more bond levies for schools because people are tapped out on property taxes. And property taxes in Montana are substantially higher than they are in our neighboring states. And this is a way for us to provide permanent property tax relief over a long period of time for all Montanans using a resource that's already there. This year, there's a structural budget surplus of $268 million. In fact, we have that much in excess revenue over the projections. So there's plenty of revenue to do it. The question is, are you going to use it to expand government, or are you going to use it to lower taxes on Montana
Thank you.
citizens?
Mr. Bullock, 1 minute.
I think the Wyoming example is exactly what happened. When natural gas prices dropped, Governor Meade ended up having to cut $100 million from his budget. And even as the congressman says, well, $225 million in oil and gas revenues to date. Now that money is actually used right now for our schools, for our local communities. That's what builds the county infrastructure, the half of it. So we can't create money out of nowhere. Now, don't get me wrong, and as we develop our natural resources, I'll be investing more in schools. And I'll be investing more in schools even as under my administration as things are. But the whole education plan that the congressman's laid out, other than the privatizing pieces, isn't talking about investing more in schools. It's actually just a shell game of moving things from one place to the other, not creating any new money.
Our plan is certainly a property tax relief plan, and I make no apologies for that. The goal of this is to use oil and gas revenues to lower your property taxes. And why shouldn't you share in it? That revenue stream is part of your heritage as well. I think the important point here is that what Steve is saying is he wants to take $450 million surplus and probably a structural surplus of $250 million and spend it on more government. And I'm saying this is your money, and it ought to come back to you. And it ought to come back to you in the form of property tax relief.
Thank you. And now a question from Jackie Yamanaka to Mr. Bullock.
Mr. Bullock, should Montana create a rainy day fund? Perhaps something like an oil tax trust, kind of patterned after the coal tax trust?
I mean, Montana has a rainy day fund, which is in part the Coal 7 Trust. And in order to actually get into that, it takes supermajority vote of legislature. And good things happen with the dollars that are generated from that trust. Some of it goes in the general fund, some of it funds the many economic development programs and the Treasury State Endowment Program and others all across our state, and long-term meaningfully makes a significant difference in doing so. But in addition to that, and that is a fund that I think that we ought to be pretty darn careful before we want to try to tap into it. But also the opportunities are is that, I mean, under this last governor for the last 8 years, we have had surpluses. And as governor, I think that that's something that folks expect. And I'll keep a little bit of the grain in the bin. When there's additional money to give back, I will give back some to taxpayers. I mean, my plan actually gives the average taxpayer twice as much as the congressman's, and where the congressman's tax cuts would go is largely to out-of-state corporations. I want to invest in Montana and Montana Main Streets, and I'll do that through both my tax plans and my economic plans.
Actually, our plan is $100 million worth of tax relief every year. Steve wants to give it to you once. We want to give it to you every year. I agree that we need to have reserve funds, and we do. We have a school trust fund and we have a coal trust fund, which are fairly significant, and I think you need to maintain an ending fund balance, and we will. Enough cushion so that if economic conditions change slightly, we can make adjustments to the budget to make sure that we don't shortchange anybody. There's plenty of money here to go around. The governor said that we should use 1/3 of this money for tax relief. We're using maybe 40% of it for tax relief. Our proposal is far more in line with the governor than Steve is.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
Our plan would give every taxpayer, or every homeowner in Montana, $400 in immediate tax rebate. That could be spent on Main Street, could be put for down payment to pay some bills, whatever it might be. The Congressman's $200 million tax break, the average person would get about $100 a year off of it. Now, if you have a $10 million house on Flathead Lake, sure, you'd get $11,000. If you're a larger out-of-state corporation, you'd get even more. Where I want to do is invest in it. It's your money, it's your efforts. I want to make sure that we're investing in Montanans and Main Street.
And now a question from Chuck Johnson to Mr. Hill.
Mr. Hill, some large telecommunications companies and industries are proposing to change how centrally assessed property is valued and taxed by the state. Governor Schweitzer says this will shift about $100 million in property taxes from a dozen out-of-state corporations to 45,000 Montana businesses and 350,000 Montana homeowners. Do you support or oppose this plan? Why or why not?
I don't support that plan at all. As a matter of fact, Steve was making reference to the business equipment tax, and I would love to get rid of the business equipment tax entirely. In fact, it was scheduled to be gone in about 2005, and the governor reinstated it. But I think we have to look at our property tax policy for all of these classifications to examine whether or not our tax policy is competitive. Because the important question here is not how much they pay in taxes. The important question is our tax policy a detriment to investment in that kind of infrastructure in Montana? And so, as I've mentioned to you before, Chuck, I think we have to look at this in a comprehensive way before we begin down the path of changing any of those special property classifications, and even including the business equipment tax. That's why I haven't made a specific proposal with regard to the business equipment tax, because I think we need to look at that in the context of all the other taxes that we have. There are constitutional issues associated with this, there are equity issues that are associated with this, and it's going to require a more comprehensive look.
Thank you. Mr. Bullock.
I don't think we should change the centrally assessed tax system as it is. I think that we need to make certain, because there have been problems in some communities where there are challenges to that tax. Tax protests are held up then, and dollars that could be invested in the schools and the like are held up for a significant period of time. There's been proposals in the past, and I'd advance a proposal that for those dollars that are being protested, that we could have a pool of money in the state so it's not the local communities being held hostage. But our tax structure, I mean, it is even the conservative groups that say it's the 8th best in the nation. And as the congressman says, well, the property tax of Idaho or Wyoming's higher. Let's also remember that those communities have a sales tax.
Mr. Hill?
Yeah, I think this all has to be put into context, and you're right. In other states, businesses are paying sales taxes on those properties, and that has to be calculated as how that impacts the competitiveness. The important point here is that we want to have those kinds of investments in Montana, and if the tax policy is causing people to not make the kind of quality investments that we want, then we need to look at the tax policy. But I certainly wouldn't be looking at providing large tax relief to large corporations. That isn't part of it at all. It's all just about the way we tax those people to make sure that the tax policy itself isn't adverse to our economic interests.
Thank you. And now a question from Tom Ludi to Mr. Bullock.
Yes, Mr. Bullock. Your party in its platform is calling for the full disclosure of chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing, and also state-funded monitoring of land, air, and water affected by fracking. The oil industry says chemical recipes used to crack the earth are proprietary, and that ratcheting up regulations will only hurt Montana's oil economy. How will you address this issue?
We certainly do need to protect where there are legitimate trade secrets. I mean, there are property interests and privacy interests in those legitimate trade secrets. So from that perspective, it's always a balance of the disclosure versus the trade secrets. What we're seeing more and more in other states as well, though, is that it's not a magic recipe that's actually going in there. And there is more and more disclosure. And I think that there is the possibility to do that disclosure as long as we're protecting what is a legitimate trade secret. The question of monitoring and the possibilities for doing so, wherever we can, it does make sense for either an individual landowner to do a baseline monitoring just to make sure that, you know, their water supply and others isn't changed. Even in the Attorney General's office on our consumer protection side, you know, we tried to provide landowners, as the oil men and gas men are coming up and saying, boy, do I have a deal for you with a lease, some basic information of the questions to ask to make sure that individuals are protected as they enter into these transactions.
You know, the technology in this area is advancing to the point now that there are even biodegradable products that are used as part of this process, and I think that's something we should continue to encourage. I don't think that there's that much difference in terms of what the chemistry is. It's, you know, how much of each chemical that is used that the oil companies think is proprietary. And I agree with Steve that we have a responsibility to protect what is truly a proprietary interest. I really think that this is an issue that has less and less controversy with it going forward, because I think technology is diminishing the fears, at least, that are out there. You have to keep in mind that these wells are down 5,000 to 10,000 feet. The amount of pressure that is created into that environment is really intense. And so whatever gets injected into those wells comes out pretty fast, pretty quickly. And so there isn't any evidence, I think, that any of that is migrating into the water supply or causing any kind of pollution, because it's so far away from the water supply and from the surface.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds. Okay. We'll go on to the next question. Jackie Yamanaka, a question for Mr. Hill.
Mr. Hill, there are 5 ballot initiatives this fall, and I'm just going to pick one and ask you if you would please say if you're going to vote for or against and why. And that's Initiative 166, and I'll just summarize: a policy that corporations are not human beings with constitutional rights.
Corporations are not human beings. They're not people. They are persons in the law, which means that they can be sued and can sue other people. But corporations are an association of people. The stockholders of that organization are people. The people that manage the business are people. The people who work in the business are people. And so the issue then is should they have the rights, the access to the courts, and in that process of access to the courts, should they be treated on equal footing? And since they are associations of people, I think what the Supreme Court has said is that they should be treated the same. I'll probably vote for the initiative because I believe that corporations aren't people. But my biggest concern about voting for that is that the last thing I want to do is to give the Congress of the United States, regardless of which political party is in charge of the Congress of the United States, the power to decide who can and can't speak and who can and can't express their views. Because there is just too much special interest, too much drive to gain power, that I just don't think that we should be tinkering with the Constitution.
Thank you. Mr. Bullock.
As your Attorney General, when the Citizens United decision first came up in the U.S. Supreme Court, in a bipartisan effort, we joined in other states and said, you know, states ought to be able to decide whether elections are decided by unlimited corporate expenditures or by individuals like those of us who gather this evening for this debate. And we fought that all throughout, and we'll continue to fight that. Because really this is part of, as we turn on our television, I mean, democracy is at stake here. I-166 deals with unlimited corporate expenditures in elections, and that's at its heart. I think we need to do everything we can to keep this discussion going to ensure that we have control over our elections, and as a result, we'll certainly end up supporting that.
Mr. Hill, 30 seconds.
I think one thing that Steve and I agree on is that the unlimited expenditure of money by special interest groups in political campaigns is not a good thing. As a member of Congress, I joined with 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats that took on what was then called soft money, which is corporate and union money, that were just dominating the political parties, and we were able to make changes that have been sustained by the Supreme Court. So there are ways for us to bring this back, I think, to a place where we can all trust that the process is fair and open. And so it's a real simple process. When I'm governor, I'll work with the legislature to make sure the process is equal. Everybody plays by the same rules. It's completely transparent, so everybody knows what's going on. And I think we get to that place, we can restore confidence that campaign financing is working.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Your time is up. And now a question, Chuck Johnson, a question for Mr. Bullock.
Mr. Bullock, another measure on the ballot is IR 124. It's a referendum on whether to keep or reject the medical marijuana law that the 2011 legislature passed, a more restrictive law. How do you intend to vote on that and why?
I think we're still in the middle and part of litigation on that. Maybe it's all wrapped up. I will probably vote, I guess, against the initiative which would, well, whichever way would repeal last legislature's changes. Because at the end of the day, and we worked hard to actually get some sideboards on it. I voted initially when the medical marijuana initiative was there, and I think we all had somebody in mind. And I worked with the last legislature to try to craft a solution that would actually put some legitimate sideboards on this. This will be an issue next legislative session. And we can look to states like Colorado, which has been doing a lot of work on it, New Mexico, which has been doing a bunch of work on it. Because what we want to do is make sure those in legitimate medical need have the opportunity to get medical marijuana, and those that don't are precluded from doing so. And we can do that. Last legislative session, the solution that they created didn't work. We'll need to make this part of the 2013 session.
Mr. Hill.
Well, I think I'm taking the opposite position, but I'm not sure which way to vote. But I'm going to vote to sustain what the legislature did. In this community, I think there were 58 storefronts that people became pretty concerned about. In Helena, there was an industrial growing operation, which Steve would bring back. And I disagree with Steve about his leadership. About his leadership on this issue. You know, Tom McGilvery, the majority leader, is standing out in the hall, one of our supporters. He and Representative Hunter, a Democrat leader, went to Steve late in the session and begged him to get involved in this issue to try to help craft a solution that people could work together on, and Steve turned him down. Before the session, a legislator from Havre asked Steve directly, are you going to help us deal with the problems with medical marijuana? And Steve's response at that meeting was, I don't have the political capital to take on the medical marijuana problem. This is a serious problem. In fact, I think it's the largest law enforcement problem facing Montana. I think that governors have to provide leadership on it. I think attorney generals do too.
Thank you. Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
Well, I think that's probably categorically untrue, and I'd be happy to talk to Representative McGilvery about it. A number of legislators came in early and said, will you work with us to get it repealed? Repealing wasn't the answer. Long before the legislature even showed up, we brought together the concerns of law enforcement. And that's law enforcement at all levels. And we brought them to the legislature. We worked with the interim committee. I'm not sure where Congressman Hill was at the time during that. It's Monday morning quarterbacking. No, I don't want unlimited grow operations and things like that. I don't think anybody does. I don't think we want, the chronic pain of ages 19 to 29 being the largest group. We can put sideboards on this, and we can actually make it as other states have done, and it'll make a difference.
Thank you. And now a question from Tom Ludy to Mr. Hill.
Yes, Mr. Hill. As you know, there's a strong Asian market for Montana coal, but concerns about long trains, new coal seaports, and greenhouse gases from Montana coal burned overseas have complicated this issue. How would you address coal development and coal shipping through these communities as governor?
Well, first of all, I want the jobs that come from coal development. I want the mining jobs that come from it. I would like to see more mine mouth generation and actually add value so we can create more jobs in that respect. But there's no doubt that a lot of this coal is going to be in demand from Asian markets. As a matter of fact, those Asian markets are expected to go up by 250% over the next decade, and we want to take advantage of the opportunity to ship coal to them. And so we're going to have to work with our neighboring states to make sure that those loading facilities are built so that we can export that coal. I think what's really important is that we keep those jobs here in the United States rather than Canada, because if we don't build those loading facilities in the United States, they'll build them in Canada and it'll get exported through Canada. I strongly, passionately support coal development. I'm the guy that came up with the idea of getting Otter Creek transferred to the state of Montana so we could develop that coal and open Powder River Basin coal in Montana to development as it is in Wyoming. And so I'll work with those communities to make sure that it works for them as well.
Mr. Bullock.
Yeah, I think it's with any long-term infrastructure challenges that government will play a role, private industry will play a role as well. If the coal trains that are realized and has been discussed actually ends up going through our communities, there will be impacts, and we'll have to address those infrastructure impacts. But we'll also have a lot of additional revenues to do so. So I think it's something that long-term working together with our communities that we'll be able to address some of the challenges.
Mr. Hill, 30 seconds.
You know, I want to go back to our proposal to cap the coal trust for 10 years and use that money to fund infrastructure. I think it's an important idea because transportation infrastructure, water and sanitation infrastructure, and education infrastructure in Montana needs a lot of attention. And that's one of the ways that we'll be able to help those communities address the transportation concerns that they have.
And now a question from Jackie Yamanaka for Mr. Bullock.
Mr. Bullock, the next governor will have just a few weeks before the 2013 Montana legislature convenes, and you will be inheriting a budget. One of you will be inheriting a budget that largely will be crafted by the outgoing administration. So if budgets reflect priorities, what specifically would you say are your immediate budget concerns?
Yeah, it's a cruel trick that they have the governor being sworn in the same day the legislature meets, and you already have to have your budget there as well. I think that there's a number of things. First of all, my priority is going to be jobs in Main Street, Montanans. That's why we proposed a business equipment tax for 11,000 small businesses throughout Montana. We proposed a $400 tax break to every homeowner in Montana, and we'll provide that within this next budget. Investments in infrastructure that we've talked about, a bonding bill is a significant piece of it. We need to invest in infrastructure, including our two-year colleges. When last legislative session they killed the bonding bill, that killed the opportunity for not only to better our educational system, but immediate jobs. Also have additional investments in education as well.
Our priorities will be, number one, we're going to use oil and gas revenues to fund education so that we can lower property taxes all across Montana. In addition to that, we have challenges in eastern Montana right now with the infrastructure challenges that are going to limit our ability to develop natural resources, particularly oil and gas out there, so we've got to give some priority to that. Education is always a priority. We're going to link more funding to education by insisting that we move towards a model that puts more emphasis on outcomes and less emphasis on inputs. What that means is that we want to move to a model where we're rewarding good teachers. And in fact, we're really rewarding great teachers. Quality schools come from having a quality teacher in the classroom, by having high academic standards, and by having tension in the system that drives us towards excellence. And we want to make those kind of reforms as part of our education package. So those will be our priorities.
Mr. Bullock, 30 seconds.
And I guess I should also include a couple of the other priorities, which wouldn't have been heard as well. We talked about earlier putting a cap on college tuition. That's something that we can do and immediately impacts families. With the tax cuts that the congressman proposes and the privatizing of public education, I'm not sure where the money comes from for that. We need to actually address that many of our state employees haven't had a pay increase in 5 years. Price of gas has gone up, price of milk's gone up, other things, and we also need to give a little assistance to those public employees.
And now let's squeeze in one last question from Chuck Johnson to Mr. Hill.
Mr. Hill, Montana has increasingly turned to community corrections, pre-release centers, and probation and parolees to slow the growth of its correction population. This includes sending 300 meth addicts to treatment rather than long-term incarceration. Yet the prison population still grows. What are your plans for handling corrections, which takes up about a third of the state budget, and would the hardened jail fit into your plans?
You know, there's a saying in the legislature that the money goes to medicate, educate, and incarcerate, and there's some truth to that. I support the efforts in community corrections, and I'll continue to support that effort. The challenge that we have in our prison population has put a lot of budget pressure on, and I think that we need to look at alternatives, such as contracting with private prisons and other organizations to try to help us deal with the ups and downs of that. In some instances, those alternatives are able to deliver correction services even at lower cost than we can do so directly. So those are the ways I'll approach it.
Mr. Bullock.
I think we've even, as Attorney General, tried to address some of the challenges. When you look at the 24/7 sobriety project, what that did is we're second and subsequent DUI offenders. We're trying to keep them not only sober, but out of the jails and continuing to work and continue to be productive. Treatment courts are another area where when we focus on offenders as individuals and not statistics, I think that we can do some great things to keeping them on a path and keeping them out of our jail and prisons. Some of the movement to more probation, parole, and intensive supervision, I think, is a good thing to do. And that is one of the ways that we can lower correction costs, but it's also trying to keep people in communities that can stay in communities rather than building additional facilities.
Mr. Hill, 30 seconds.
You know, I think that one of the challenges that we have in corrections is the high recidivism rate that we have. And the state of Washington implemented my idea, which is priority budgeting, to address this. And they found that the policies they had were actually doing the opposite. They were actually increasing the recidivism rate rather than reducing it. I have some strong ideas, I think, about trying to work with prisoners to identify both their skills and their orientation in terms of their aptitude to prepare them for leaving prison. And through that process, I think we can reduce recidivism, and if we can reduce recidivism, we'll reduce the prison population numbers.
Thank you. And we've run out of time for questions, so now we'll give each candidate 2 minutes for a closing statement about their campaign to be Montana's next governor. Mr. Bullock will go first, and then Mr. Hill will have the last word. And gentlemen, first, thank you for agreeing to debate here tonight. It's been a stimulating discussion. Now, Mr. Bullock, 2 minutes, please.
Thanks, Steve, and thank all of you for coming out tonight and being engaged in this election. It's about 14 months ago that Lisa and I, my wife, and our 3 children came to Billings, joined with my parents, Jack and Penny Copps, and other supporters in announcing my run for governor. And at that time I said that, you know, I came to that decision in part after the last legislative session, recognizing that my oldest, if I got to serve 2 terms, would just be leaving high school when I got kicked out of the governor's office. And it truly, to me, is what kind of Montana that we could provide these kids and all Montanans. How are we going to go in the future? And if my thought at that time is truly, and it is, that we're at a crossroads, and the people that we elect are going to define whether we bring the state forward or be looking in the rearview mirror, with 28 days left until the election, I think that difference is that much more clear. I think great things have been going on in our state. I think we can responsibly develop our resources, but also invest in small businesses, make sure that the jobs of the future are located here. We don't have to look back 50 years. We can look forward 50 years. I don't want to look back 50 years when it comes to workers' rights, women's health care, our educational system, the access to our courts. I want to say, where can Montana become? And our economy is only as big as we want it to be. I've had the chance throughout this campaign to visit businesses large and small, and there's exciting things happening. I've had the opportunity to visit different educational institutions where we're training kids, and even in high school, in different ways. We can innovate in our public system, and we can continue to improve it. I've been able to sit at the college, Missoula College as an example, built for 700 students, has 2,800 in it right now. We need to invest in our infrastructure, in our education, and in our future. And if we do that, the sky is the limit for Montana. Our economy, the question won't be what it is, it'll be how big we want it to be. And as governor, John Walsh and I will work to get there.
Thank you. Mr. Hill, your closing statement.
Today, Montana is growing slower than our neighboring states. As a matter of fact, over the last 8 years is the slowest period of job growth in the state of Montana in the last quarter of a century. And we're next to last, 49th in our take-home pay. That's why we're saying that we want to improve the business climate in Montana so that we attract the investments that will create more and better paying jobs. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently released its study, and Montana is ranked 45th in the nation in our legal environment. Most every business group out there rates our regulatory environment in the bottom third, many of them in the bottom 2 or 3. And those are making it difficult for businesses to grow. I come from the small business world, and my customers were small business owners, and I understand this. Everywhere I go, people are delaying the decisions on whether or not they'll invest in creating jobs because they're worried about the uncertain legal and regulatory environment in Montana. We also have got to get government spending more in line with the rate of growth of our economy. Government's been growing faster than the private sector. That's why we want to implement priority budgeting, and we want to use priority budgeting to improve the permitting process so that we're competitive in that regard. And we have challenges in public education. Today, 20%, almost 20% of our kids are not graduating from high school. And of those who are going to the university system, 30% of them need remedial reading and math when they get there. I don't know what the freshman class is this year at MSUB, but last year at MSUB, it was over 52% of the kids, I believe, that were in a remedial reading or math program. So we need to expect more. We have an obligation to the next generation of Montanans to do 3 things. Give them an opportunity for a good job here in Montana, not somewhere else. Make sure that they have a government that they can afford that's working for them, not against them. And having schools that are working, that are preparing them for the competition of this century. That's what Rick Hill and John Sanjo will do as the next governor and lieutenant governor of the state of Montana. Thank you.